Well, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. So on Dwight D. Eisenhower's Order of the Day for D-Day, he lays out three big goals or aims for the American forces. And these are read to all the soldiers, not just American, but the Allies. The first is to break up the German war-making machine. The third is to secure peace for ourselves and our allies in the post-war world. But the second one is really what we're going to talk about this evening. It's about liberating the oppressed peoples of Europe as one of the three main aims that Eisenhower lays out. And tonight we have Dr. Alex Richie on the subject of collaborators, resistors, victims, bystanders, life under German occupation. Now, Alex, as you heard earlier today, is a historian of Germany and Central Europe. She's written about the history of Berlin, Warsaw 1944, and she's one of our advisors to help put together our international conference. So has been quite instrumental in that, and as many of you know, is instrumental in our educational travel program. Now, in addition, after Alex's talk, she'll invite Maud Dahm to join her on stage, assuming, the boat doesn't rock too much here. Some of you can probably feel that. But as you heard from yesterday, Maud's a Dutch Holocaust survivor. Her and her sister lived in hiding during German occupation, and it'll be a special opportunity for us to hear from her. So with that, please help me welcome Alex Richie.
Yes. Does this work? Yeah, this way. Good. I hope everybody can hear me. I can hear myself, so this is a good thing. I'm so happy to see all of you here, despite, as Mike said, the ship moving around a little bit. So many people I've traveled with before, and so many people who are supporters of the National WWII Museum. And of course, I'm incredibly honored, specifically after hearing the amazing talks from our veterans earlier today, to have Maud Dahm here, who was a Holocaust survivor and really an amazing witness to another aspect of World War II, which we're going to talk about. So I've been asked to give an overview of what was going on as we're making our way to the Netherlands and into Amsterdam, talk a little bit about the sort of overview, what the Nazis were doing, what it meant to be under occupation in the Netherlands. And then Maud and I will have a conversation. Maud will describe her life and her experiences in a very specific aspect of that. So one of the things I really love about the National WWII Museum, and there are many, many things, is that one of the ways that the museum very specifically attempts to try and help with education, particularly of young people, is to meet people who had some connection to the war. And I'm sure that all of you, in one form or another, would have had a connection to, for example, the Normandy landings, or to the war in the Pacific, or to whatever it might be. And that's why you're here. Somebody told you about something when you were young, or a great teacher told you something, or you're related to somebody who was in the war in some way or other. And this is it's something that opens the door to history. And I know that that Maud is very, very involved in education. So are a lot of the veterans we saw today, and so is the museum indeed. And I think this is a lesson as to how to carry on into the next generation. This is something we talk about very often. And when it comes to my own personal involvement with the Netherlands and my love of the city of Amsterdam, it's because of two people that I grew up with in my life who, fortunately for me, were very, very, very talkative. We know that a lot of vets and a lot of survivors were not. They didn't speak about their experiences at all. But in my case, and maybe this is where I get this from, the gab, but my grandfather who landed at Juno Beach, he was Canadian, landed at Juno Beach, was at Market Garden, and then fought his way up into the Netherlands, and talked a lot about it, and particularly things like the hunger winter, how terrible it was for the civilians of the Netherlands when he saw them at the end of the war. And then he stayed on actually in the Netherlands after the war. So he had very many, very incredibly interesting experiences. And another very, very, very important influence on my life was my very much beloved uncle who married my mom's older sister, my uncle Lodo, Ludovic, who was born in Amsterdam to a very old, wealthy, important Jewish Amsterdam family. His last name was Wertheim Amies. His mother was a Citroën of the Citroën car family. But they're old, traditional family, ties and heritage in Amsterdam did not save them. And he and his twin brother were the only ones that survived from his family. He then went to Canada, which is where he eventually, in his second marriage, met my mum's older sister, and hence a very large family ensued from that. So this is a very important, as I said, aspect for me about the museums, this personal stories and the way in which the museum tries to bring these stories to life. And again, in my own personal experience, this is what opened the door for me to the Holocaust history. What was it like to be a young boy in this situation? He was born in 1930, so he was old enough to remember quite a lot of his experiences in Amsterdam even before the war. So I've been asked to talk about what happened in the Netherlands, generally speaking, in the war. And before the war, the Netherlands was really one of the wealthiest countries in Europe. Dutch colonies such as present-day Indonesia was one of the top five oil producers in the world, for example. And they were neutral. They hadn't been attacked in World War I. And so a lot of people thought somehow they were going to be immune, even if Hitler became aggressive and so on. They'd be like Switzerland. Nothing was going to happen to them. And so despite the wealth of the government didn't pay for military expenditure. They were spending sort of 3 or 4%, even as close as 1939 to the war. And of course, everywhere else, like all over the world, including in the United States, the Great Depression had a huge influence on the Netherlands, and numerous fascist movements grew up, including the most important, which was the Dutch fascist party, the NSB, which was modeled really on Italian fascism, more like Mussolini, but also with elements of Hitler's Nazi party as well thrown in. And my uncle, I remember talking to him about the invasion. He said the invasion for he and his family on the 10th of May 1940 came as a complete and utter shock. And I said, how could that be? I mean, look what Hitler was doing. And he said, we just didn't expect the war to come to us. We just didn't expect it. They thought neutrality would protect them. And Germany didn't even issue a formal declaration of war. They just, invaded. And the Germans claimed all sorts of things. They claimed they wanted to draw Allied forces in and, prevent a British invasion and all this. But the Dutch understood that this was really a lie. And as I said, my uncle remembered being in their house in Amsterdam when the first hint that they had that something was really wrong was they heard air raid sirens. And all of a sudden, these air raid sirens were wailing. And usually, sometimes there are tests of sirens and they go off and everything's fine. But these just would go on and on and on. And his mom and dad and his twin brother came in and they said, well, what should we do? Should we go to the hallway? Should we go to the basement? Should we, hide under the table? They weren't prepared. They didn't know what to do. And of course, very, very quickly, tragically, the Germans invaded and the Dutch were just not prepared. They had outdated weapons. They had poorly trained troops. And there were, of course, some heroic moments. So, for example, the Dutch defended The Hague, which allowed the Queen and the government to escape to the United Kingdom, creating a government in exile. But these successes were few and far between, tragically. And however, there were also tragedies. And this picture is a picture of the city of Rotterdam. We've talked about Hamburg, but this is Rotterdam. The Dutch fought in Rotterdam from the beginning. The Germans didn't want to attack the city itself for fear of suffering casualties, their own casualties, I mean. But the Dutch garrison was given an ultimatum, but the Germans hadn't signed a piece of paper. So the Dutch gave it back and tried to remedy this problem while this whole business of the paper was being sorted out. The Luftwaffe came in and bombed the city, and this is the result. 800 or so people died, called the Rotterdam Blitz. The Dutch High Command were horrified by this destruction of Rotterdam, and the city of Utrecht was given a similar ultimatum, and the Dutch commander-in-chief, Henry Winkelmann, met the other generals, and they decided that the resistance at this point was senseless. What was it going to accomplish? You'd kill a lot of civilians, you'd end up with more cities looking like this, and that there was really no way that they could resist this juggernaut of the Germans coming in, no matter what they did. So on the 15th of May 1940, Winkelmann signed the unconditional surrender. Now, in the end, about 2,300 Dutch soldiers were killed and about 3,000 civilians, so their war was quite short and not particularly deadly. And as I said, the Queen Wilhelmina and the Dutch government went to the United Kingdom and set up this government in exile in London. But then you have pictures that would have been repeated all over the Netherlands, just as they were all over occupied Europe. Your town, your village, all of a sudden the sound of, goose-stepping Nazis helmeted in uniform going through your town, your village, and basically taking over. And this particular picture was of The Hague. It's interesting, just as an aside, that because the Queen and the government had gone to London, the Netherlands was placed under the control of a German civilian governor. So this was unlike France. This was unlike Denmark, which had their own governments, or Belgium, which came under German military control. The Dutch government came under civilian control, and it was headed by an Austrian Nazi Reichskommissar, Arthur Seyss-Inquart. And at first, the Nazis used a kind of velvet glove approach. This was not like the invasion of Poland or later the invasion of the Soviet Union. At the beginning, Hitler decided that the Dutch were good Aryans and that they could be incorporated into the Reich. They didn't ask the Dutch, but this was his idea. As I said earlier this morning, for those of you who listen to the historians talk, this was a racially motivated regime. And so they decided the Dutch were fine and thought of them as Aryans. And so what they did was they brought in about 1,500 German civil servants, stuck them at the top of the government, and then expected all the Dutch civil servants to do exactly what they'd said. And everywhere the Germans introduced their rule of law, their rule, I would say, the Gestapo, the Sicherheitsdienst, all those authoritarian police apparatus were set up. And then everywhere else, the Germans introduced the infamous Gleichschaltung, which meant everything had to conform to the Nazi system. So you couldn't have a political party that wasn't National Socialist in any way. They controlled the churches, they controlled youth groups, they controlled theaters, they controlled every single thing. They also tried to convert the population to their way of thinking through radio and through propaganda and so on. And it wasn't particularly successful. However, it has to be said in the Netherlands, there were collaborators and there were people who could live with the regime. We see the same thing in France and the same thing elsewhere. People had to adapt, and Seyss-Inquart kept repression and economic extraction quite low at the beginning. He lulled people into thinking that, okay, if we just live through the war, then it'll be okay. And, for example, Dutch companies benefited greatly from the opening of markets into Germany. In the early years, many felt that the Nazis would win the war, and so maybe it was better to kind of keep friendly with them. And this encouraged a minority to work with the Germans. But the Netherlands was not pro-Nazi in any recognizable sense. Then things start to change with Operation Barbarossa. 1941, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, the scales dropped from the eyes all over the place. The massive losses on the Eastern Front, the shocks of the losses, like not getting Moscow, Stalingrad, then Kursk, led to increased pressure everywhere in the German-occupied areas, including the Netherlands. The Germans increased economic extraction from the country, repression began to increase, and the so-called Arbeitsansatz, the drafting of civilians for forced labor, continued to grow. This started to affect everybody, especially young men. Every man between the age of 18 and 45, about over 500,000 of them were forced to work in German factories. And now even more and more and more were being rounded up randomly and being sent to work in factories in Germany itself. And many who did not want to do this started to go into hiding. And other privations followed as well. The Germans decided to make the Netherlands the main area for Air Force bases from which to attack the United Kingdom, which required more forced labor to build air bases and other installations. And then when that failed, then Hermann Goering decided that this would be the greatest base for defensive operations. So the air war over the Netherlands, the huge amounts of flak and so on were built here. The Nazis also used slave laborers to build the Atlantic Wall. This gigantic coastal fortification goes all the way from Norway all the way down to southwestern France. And of course, it included the coastline of the Netherlands. And in all of these massive building works, of course, slave labor was required. Also, towns were partly destroyed. The Hague was cleared. about 20,000 homes were cleared, and about 65,000 people had to move out of their lovely places in The Hague because the Nazis said so. The repression, of course, above all, was meted out to the Jews. Now, in 1939, the Jewish population was around about 150,000, with then about 30,000 Jewish refugees who tragically came from places like Germany and Austria in the hope that getting to neutral Netherlands would save them from Nazi persecution. People like Anne Frank and her family, who were not Dutch. And they, of course, came thinking they were going to be safe, and they were not. And also the Nazi persecution of the Jews began quite slowly at first. The Dutch Jews did not really realize for a time the danger. So I just recently talked to my uncle. He's still alive. He's 94 years old, and he said, when I told him that I was going to talk a little bit about, this is a picture of his mother, by the way. I said, I'm going to put a picture of your mom up on the thing, and he wept. Actually, we were on a Zoom call. He was so emotional about it, and I said, well, what do you really remember about those early years after the Germans came? And he said there was one thing that stood out. He remembered there was a day of white carnations, 29th of June, 1940, which was an anti-German protest because the Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands had always wore a white carnation. Of course, they'd fled to London. But on his birthday, all the Dutch, including the Dutch Jews, put out white carnations in the shop windows, and they wore them, and they put them in their hair, and they put them everywhere else. And the shops and so on were filled with flowers. And he remembered that they all took part in this. They were on the streets. They did not feel divided yet from Dutch society, and so he participated in this as a normal Dutch citizen who was very much a part of Amsterdam life. And so that's already just 1940. So it just shows. And as in other occupied countries, the Germans were very, very clever as to how they step by step managed the Jewish population. One of the most insidious, awful things they did was they used the Jews to themselves identify and write down where Jews were living and so on through a Jewish council in the Netherlands headed by Professor David Cohen. And they believed that they were helping their fellow Jewish citizens by keeping them free from Nazi control. But in reality, the Jewish Council later served as an instrument for the Nazis to identify the Jews, where they lived, and later allowing the Nazis the ability to round up and deport victims much, much more easily than if they'd had to go house to house and try and find this population themselves. So in 1940, there were minor measures taken against the Jews, some attacks against public officials, for example, against professors, but there were not yet any deportations. In February 1941 was the first deportation of a small number of Jews, in which a very small group was taken to the camp at Mauthausen, a terrible camp. And a group of young Jews protested against the Nazis in Amsterdam. 600 SS men moved in and arrested about 400 young Jewish men who were beaten up, and then they were sent to Buchenwald. And the Dutch responded with an act that's unique in occupied Europe. It was called the February Strike, which turned into a nationwide protest against the deportations. And of course, it didn't accomplish very much. They couldn't do very much, but it was a demonstration that at least a certain percentage of the Dutch population really did not agree with the Nazi policy against the Jews. But as we know from all over Europe, the Nazis were relentless. The Jews were not permitted to work in the civil service anymore. They were banned from public transport, then banned from parks, then banned from cafes. And in May 1942, Jews were required to wear the Star of David. By June, they had to register themselves to be transferred to work in Germany at some point in the future. And of course, the changes were due to the evolution of the Holocaust itself. In late summer 1941, Hitler took the decision to undertake the final solution, the mass murder of every single man, woman, and Jewish child in occupied Europe. And the decision was given the rubber stamp at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. So now, instead of being able to try and function somehow, despite the restrictions in society, Jews were to be sent to camps in the East and exterminated, either through work, some of them, but the mass of them not. And the main destination for the Jews of Amsterdam was to be Auschwitz. my uncle's mum ended up doing the same route effectively as Anne Frank, going to Westerbork camp, then to Auschwitz, and she survived Auschwitz. And her parents were immediately killed in Auschwitz. They were selected for immediate murder, but she survived and died in Bergen-Belsen. So in 1942, the Germans changed the Westerbork transit camp. As I said, that it originally had been used to help the Jews who were coming into the Netherlands to find safety. Now the Germans repurposed it to be the kind of transit camp for the Jews who were now going to be, quote unquote, resettled in the East. So about half the Jewish population, 79,000 people, lived in Amsterdam, and preparations are now made for the mass deportations. So the Jews were rounded up district by district. They were also helped, it has to be said, by people in city administration, the Dutch police, some of them, Dutch railway workers. Nazi authorities began to just arrest Jews in the streets of the city and take them to these assembly points for deportations, including places like there was a municipal theater building. And so when you got to a certain number of people, then they were sent off to Westerbork, and then they were sent, as I said, to Auschwitz-Birkenau. In May 1943, the Nazis ordered 7,000 Jews, including members of the Jewish Council, to meet in the city square for deportation, but only 500 people showed up. And the Germans responded by sealing off the Jewish quarter, rounding up the rest of the Jews, going from house to house to house to find people. And the Jewish population that was left in the city began to realize that the only hope to evade capture was to go into hiding somehow. And again, from May through September 43, the Germans carried on these raids and also confiscated property left behind by the Jews. In 1942 alone, the contents of about 10,000 apartments in Amsterdam were expropriated by the Germans and the goods shipped to Germany. And it was at this point that my uncle and his brother, his mother and father, said, we've got to get you at least into hiding. So they were hidden first by a neighbor, and then they were hidden out in the countryside in 3 different places. And he remembers the maid sewing gems into her fur coat, beautiful jewels and so on. Her husband was a very well-known art historian, art collector, and they were very well off. And all these gemstones and so on were sewn into her coat. Well, of course, they would all have been stolen at Auschwitz. And my uncle and his brother were saved, but as I said, all the rest of the family perished in the Holocaust. So there is another aspect to this as well, and that is the side of the collaborationists. And although many Dutch people were against all of these actions, not all of them were. There was collaboration. About 3/4 of Dutch Jews were murdered during the Holocaust, unlike in Belgium, where about 40% perished, and in France, where 25% perished. And collaboration took many forms. Some Dutch people agreed with the National Socialist principles, including anti-Semitism. There were also groups like the Colony Heineke group who searched for Jews and gave them up in exchange for money. The Germans also paid bounty to Dutch police in order to give people up, and so on. And of course, there was the Dutch Nazi Party, the NSB, which was also active in all of these things. And it went further. The photograph on the picture on the right, it says Nederlanders, and you see a very strange picture of a Dutch man, but with an SS helmet. This was the 1940 September. The Nederlandische SS was formed. And in the end, about 25,000 Dutchmen agreed to volunteer to fight with the SS on the Eastern Front in the Waffen-SS. And in another strange, really weird twist of fate, which I'll just mention for those of you who've been on either my Rise and Fall or the Medica Structure tours, we end up having dinner in my house just outside of Warsaw. It was the headquarters of the Waffen-SS taken over in the summer of 1944. And there were Dutch, as well as Norwegians and others in this house who'd come all the way from the Netherlands and ended up in Poland to fight against the Red Army. But with collaboration, of course, also came resistance. And this is a picture of the 101st Airborne with the guys with the armbands are members of the Dutch resistance fighters. And Dutch resistance also took many levels, from men hiding from forced labor to deliberate sabotage in factories. And Dutch resistance started actually immediately through things like organizations like the Communist Party, and the Dutch government in exile, people who were loyal to them, and so on. And they became more and more organized, and even toward the end of the war, killing high-ranking Nazis. Of course, this always had huge repercussions and so on, but these things were undertaken as well. And one of the most dangerous tasks was to help people in hiding. People in hiding included many, not just Jews. They were also underground operatives, those people still hiding from forced labor, downed Allied airmen. Those of you who've watched Masters of the Air, there's a scene when the underground are trying to hide. A couple of the airmen and another collaborator is shot, and the two guys are just shocked, and the underground men say, no, he was a collaborator. They were very clever. They could infiltrate, and then, of course, putting everybody in extreme danger. So it's a very interesting scene. But, of course, the Jews, about 16,500, were able to hide because of help from the people in the Netherlands. And Maud Daum, who will talk to us in a minute about her time in hiding, was one of them. My uncle Lodo was another, and his twin brothers. And while his mother, Marcel Citroën, were murdered, and as I said, the family sent to Auschwitz, he and his brother survived the war and ended up, as I said, in Canada. And then we finally have the last chapter. This is a picture of liberation, the Canadians coming through. And the Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944 saw the Western Allies rapidly advance toward the Dutch border. And the Dutch, of course, thought they were going to be liberated very quickly. Tragically, this was not the case. As I mentioned, my grandfather landed at Juno Beach and then went up into the Netherlands after fighting in Market Garden. But the problem was that even by October 1944, the Germans still controlled the Scheldt estuary and approaches to Antwerp. And it took a long time for this fight to succeed, for the Dutch in that part of the Netherlands to be liberated. And again, as I said, my grandfather talked about the hunger winter, how terrible the fate was for the civilians who were literally starving. They ate, rats and cats and tulip bulbs in order to try and survive. So people from the 29th of April to the 7th of May, the RAF, along with the Royal Canadian Air Force and others, coordinated drops of food called Operation Mana. About 7,000 tons were dropped. And from the 1st to the 8th of May, again, seen in Masters of the Air, the United States Army Air Force dropped about 4,000 tons. And then there was another operation called Operation Faust, where later on food was brought in by truck, because the realization of the starvation was understood by the Allies as well. So after crossing the Rhine, the Canadians and British and Polish forces entered the Netherlands from the east, liberating vast areas. But unfortunately, the western provinces weren't liberated until the surrender of German forces on the 5th of May, 1945. But then civilians took to the streets celebrating. Again, my uncle and his twin brother had been in hiding, could come out, and so many others. And my grandfather, again, remembered the reverse, the tremendous jubilation, flowers being thrown at them and so on, as people so happy to see, in his case, Canadian forces. And I have to say, it's always very moving for me as a British Canadian person to be in the Netherlands on the 4th of May, which is the commemoration in the Netherlands for those who died during the war. And of course, there are a number of cemeteries for the American cemetery, for the Canadians, for the British, for the Poles, and for many others. And the Dutch take meticulous care of the cemeteries. I have to say, it's tremendously moving to see them. So we're undertaking this journey to commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day largely, and the events linked to it. And of course, Amsterdam is no exception to this. And as I mentioned, I have very personal feelings about Amsterdam in particular because of my family involvement there. But it's just one story of many. And now I'd like to turn over to our guest of honor, and I'll just try and find. This is a picture of Maud when she was a young girl. Amazing photograph, and we'd like to turn over the rest of the portion of this section or the session to talking to Maud about her extraordinary history and her story of survival in these circumstances. So welcome, Maud.